let me jump in with you here to this big idea of what is the soul? What is the soul? Well, I think the first thing I should say to you is the soul is not a what or an it or a thing. The soul is a who. Your soul is you. Your soul is you. It is your essence, your seat of consciousness. It is your core identity. Your soul is the face that you had before you were born. Your soul is your pre-psychological consciousness. You had a consciousness before you had a brain to give you a psychological consciousness. Before you had a brain, you had a soul. Your soul was a level of consciousness that precedes the development of an embryo and a brain and a body. Your soul came from God. Your parents conceived your body, but they did not conceive your soul. You did not get your soul from your parents. This helps because many of you, as you have grown, especially in your formative childhood years, this is often why parents will say to children, where did you get that from? Where did you get that idea from? Where did you get that desire from? Where did you get that ability from? Because a huge part of your humanity is divine. It's not genetic. It's not biological. And so biology and genetics alone don't explain lots of things about you or your destiny, because you were you before we knew the you that's in the room today. If I met you in a room as a stranger and I would say, hi, what's the first thing that we do? What's your name? My name's Paul. What's your name? My name's Sue or Phil. Then we quickly, don't we, say, where are you from? Then we get into what do you do? But my question to you is, if that was not your name, and that was not where you were from, and that is not what you did, are you still you? The answer is yes, you are. But because you don't know who that is, you just think all those labels are you. So I think in this initial session, I want to strip all of this back to what I'm calling your core seat of consciousness, core identity. In other words, you existed before you were born. Existence precedes conception. Existence precedes conception. I remind myself to sit down, because what I just said to you is pretty crazy. That you existed before you were conceived. So where were you? Well, I believe, because of my worldview, that you and I, all humans, your soul comes from God and returns to God. I don't know what that means in terms of geography, where you were. Were you lingering outside the labor ward, waiting for your soul to show up? When did your soul first enter into the human realm? I don't know. My seatedness reminds us we don't know. But what I think we do know, and what I think it's comfortable to say, is that you had an existence that was ahead of your consciousness. That you that came in the form of your core identity was here way before you got here. Now the problem for us, as I just said, is we are born into a labeling world. So imagine how many labels you have before you're even born. You are a girl or a boy. You are black or white or whatever your skin color is. This is all before you're born and decided for you. Your nationality is decided before you're born. Your socioeconomic status perhaps is decided before you're born. Your religion is decided before you're born. Where you are going to live is decided before you're born. Many, many things that we don't realize we're born with as already labels that start to conspire to confuse you and separate you from your soul identity are happening in the womb. When you are in the womb and we talk about you, and the only way we can is by exchanging labels about you and the idea of you. Then after you're born, labeling goes crazy. Because we've never lived in a more labeling world than we do now. Everybody's hashtagging everything. The moment it becomes, a trending idea, we're now labeling it, and now it adds to the layers of labeling. And now, as we live in a world that's out of control with labeling, we have more chances now than ever to get more layers between us and our soul. And so now we start having role and title and position and life stage and status and age group labelings. Now we start having circumstantial labelings. You're rich or you're poor. You are good or you are bad. You can be trusted or you can't be trusted. You are dyslexic. You are autistic. You are a criminal. You are an addict. You are an alcoholic. You are bulimic. You are all these, and on it goes. And these are all in the first few months of your life. You're growing up around this default labeling language. You're a success. You're a failure. He's a leader. She's a leader. They're a follower. They're an employer. He's an employee. That's the government. Those people are in charge. We have the words power and authority and justice system and medical term. All of this stuff, we just grow up with this massive, massive layers of labeling that are all forming layers between the core you, your soul, and all these layers that pile up as you age that separate you from the real you. My wife and I live in a 17th century farmhouse in England, and we lived there 20 years. When we bought that farmhouse 20 years ago, all the oak timbers in the house had been painted. So for generations of house owners in that house, the beautiful oak timbers had been painted. So I decided to strip all the paint off to get back to the bare oak all around the house. Some of the timbers in the house were 13th century timbers. So I started stripping back all the paint. I must admit, we were able to buy stuff then to do that now you'd be in jail for having it in your house. It was like stuff you'd only see on Breaking Bad. Don't tell me you didn't watch that. So we stripped these beams back. It took us months. It was a nightmare job. But it was fascinating to me what people thought was a good color to paint an oak beam. You could tell when we got to the 60s generations in that house. The yellows, the greens, the reds, painting an oak beam bright red. Someone should be in jail. And I tell you that as a metaphor because I think the metaphor is that this oak beam, to me, is a picture of human beings. that from before you're born and the moment you're born, life gets busy painting layers on you. This seminar is about attempting to get you to be aware of those layers, and some that are being put on you right now. Today you had a conversation that you know was an attempt by someone or something to paint another layer on you, and you had a disagreement, you felt uncomfortable, didn't like the energy of it, didn't know what to call it, but you kind of felt a part of you was in danger of being lost if you surrendered to the idea that someone else has of what color they think your life should be. So I think to get back to the bare oak version of you is to get back to the best version of you. Labels offer an identity based on external things, as I said. Name and nationality and occupation and gender and skin color and religion and role and title and conditions, you know, like I mentioned, you name it, on it goes. You know, you're troubled or a success or a failure, or you're disabled, or you're gay, or you're straight, or what. All these labels in the world offer an identity based on external things that the world put on us. We call this version of identity the ego. The ego. Ego is a Latin word for I. That's all it means. The ego means I. In other words, the ego, you and me, is the individualistic I, me, mine, separate from you, separate from others. The ego. The ego is a false sense of self. It's a false sense of self because it's your self based on labels other people painted on you. So you form an identity based on all this labeling, but because that labeling isn't who you really are underneath it all, because your core identity is your soul, these labels create a false sense of self and identity, and then the job of the ego all of your life is to protect it. This is why the ego loves attention, but it hates scrutiny. This is why another reason I have this chair here, because I want to be careful that my ego doesn't want to lecture you about your ego, because that could be my ego. Ego is a subtle, live in the shadows part of us, and self-awareness, which is a huge superpower that is going to be vital in this coming age. Self-awareness allows you to say and see, what part of me was threatened by that person that made me respond in that way? What part of me needed to exaggerate? What part of me needed to lie about something? What part of me needed to make myself look better than I really am in that situation? What part of me couldn't say, I was wrong, I'm sorry? What part of me thinks you're the problem and I could never be the problem? It's called the ego. The ego has taken entire nations to war on an individual's ego. One person's ego has taken millions into war because of the refusal to back down and not realize what you're protecting is your sense of status and power and entitlement and superiority and politics, an idea of how things should be. You see it in children. Ego kicks in from the beginning. And you see kids that begin to battle and fight over things that don't really matter, and you try and step in as a parent and educate them, not knowing it just reinvents itself in a more adult form later on. Ego is a social construct. to get you started on your journey in life. I understand the need of it. I understand why we have ego. And I want to say that ego, I know I'm reflecting it negatively because it primarily is in the outcomes, but really ego, the sense of self, isn't good or bad. But what I want to say to you is it defaults to bad without guidance. It doesn't default to good. But ego in itself, we all have ego. Jesus had an ego. Every human has an ego, a false sense of self. His would have been, wouldn't it? He was born in Nazareth. He is a carpenter's son. You can see him in his life battling this identity. As people say, well, isn't this Joseph's son? It's like, who is this person? And now they're labeling him as the boy from Nazareth. He is the carpenter's son. This helps them to locate him. So the behavior he's having, he has no right to behave that way because he has no labeling background to qualify him to speak to us in the synagogue. Because they're identifying him like they do all of us by this labeling social construct that we have, and this social construct becomes like a survival capsule through which we navigate life. But if we're not aware that we have an ego, and the ego can go rogue on you, and the ego can make you a bad version of you without guidance to make your ego serve you, as I'll come to in a moment, then we all just finish up continuing generationally to repeat the problems of the ego problems of our forefathers. Ego is a set of agreements between your childhood self and your parents. Then it becomes a set of agreements as you age between you and your peers. Then as you age, it's a set of agreements between you and your spouse, your significant other, your partner. Then ego becomes an arrangement between your politics and your nationality and your religion and your roles and so on. And the ego's job is to protect that version of you. The ego has bouncers. It has bodyguards. Because when you get too close to the issue of the ego, like we are now a little bit, it deploys anger and blame and avoidance to protect itself. We'll do this today 100 times, all of us, and not realize we're doing it. We send out these little bodyguards to fight off any incoming resistance to our version of us that we want to keep intact, because once your ego starts to collapse, you're not sure who you're going to be. And how will you do your day-to-day if you don't do it under those labelings that give you that external identity and ego? So its job is to keep all that intact. But the ego is about doing. The soul is about being. You are not just a human doing. You are a human being, and we live in this doing world where we think the more we do, the more we dance to the tune of the labels, the more accomplished and the more identity we get. And the problem is, it's the wrong identity that we're pursuing. Because if you lose your job, or you lose your freedom, or you lose your status, or you lose your identity based on what you've come to so far, if all of that is taken from you in some way, as it can be for many people in life, then who are you? If you finish up being in prison, if you finish up losing your freedom, if you finish up losing that status and that role, that salary, that position, if your family disown you, if you finish up sick or disabled and can't function where you were athletic in your career and your options, and now you have a tragedy that means you can't do that anymore, and all this stuff you planned and your ego was planning you to go for, if all of that is removed, who are you? If now you can't leave your home because of some illness and now you can't have those options anymore, that you set your heart on. Who are you? Are you still you? And the truth is, ego says, well, now you've failed and now it's not an option for you, and what a shame and how sad that is. And we start using this language about what a shame. It's such a shame that happened to so-and-so. And now the language of shame and guilt becomes another form of labeling, because now you don't appear to be able to be the person you or we hoped you would be. This is why depression and suicide, by the way, are spiking. Because we live in such an egocentric world that if anything happens to you that spoils that identity capture that you're in, you're left with nothing to fall back on, because you think now those labels have gone, I need to find more labels, and because you can't find them quick enough to cover up the cracks, we despair and get suicidal and think, what's the point in living anymore? So, ego is about survival. The soul is about surrender. This is why, by the way, for instance, like the Amish culture in America, the Amish people have very little ego problems. Because they have detached themselves from being defined by material external status and things. And I've studied ego amongst Amish communities, and it's not one of their problems at all. Because what we know is in a Western, progressive, materialistic status society, our egos get out of control. By getting more stuff, you get more stuff, then you are clearly a more important person in our eyes. That's all ego. Your ego is a false sense of self. Your soul is your true self. Now, here's the challenge and the trickiness of all this, as I said earlier. The false self and the true self both feel like yourself. The false you and the real you both feel like you. So which is right? This is why Jesus, I believe, taught, and other great spiritual leaders through history have said what he said when he said, there is a self that you need to find, and there's a self you need to let go of. Even renounce, he said. He said in Luke 9:23, Jesus said to them all, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit his soul? He's talking about the difference between, in modern language, the ego and the soul. He's talking about living in a way that saves and keeps intact the ego identity you have, but whilst grasping to that, he's saying you lose your soul, which is the real you. I know he's talking about the ego you and the soul you, because the soul part of you isn't trying to gain or get anything. So when he talks about what point is it trying to gain the whole world, that's not your soul. Your soul isn't trying to get or gain anything or impress anyone. So when he talks about gaining the whole world, he's talking about the egocentric humans, where we try to gain things to make it appear like we're doing well in life. And he's saying there's no point giving your life to the pursuit of the ego, not knowing at the end of your life and in your life you have lost touch with the essential core person of who you are. So both of these selves are inside all of us, and whichever one you give most time and attention to becomes, as you age, the defining version of you, for better or for worse. And sadly, for millions and millions, billions of us humans, it is the worst version of them we're seeing, especially in the Western world, as they're out of control with trying to gain the whole world, but losing the essence of who God really intended them to be.